Hey everyone. So I have the lucky session over lunch. So if you need to step out, get more food, people are going to come in and out. Don't worry about it. Don't feel bad. We'll keep it fairly informal. I won't take up too much of your time. And then if folks want to bring up any questions or comments at the end, feel free. Or you can always find me walking around later. So my name is Jonathan Drover. I'm AVP of Business Development at Interact Corp. Obviously, we work very closely with public sector on a number of different initiatives. I'm going to actually take a little bit of a spin on what I was initially going to talk about just based on the session next door recently. So I don't know how many people are here. Quick show of hands. How many people attended the digital identity session just now? Most? Okay, that's good. A lot of that was about digital trust, and I think my goal here was to talk about digital trust. I'll get into a little bit of, I don't need to do much history on Interact. You know what Interact is. But more specifically, what I do day to day is actually related to digital identity and working with some of the folks who were up on stage earlier. And the concept of digital trust comes up, but it kind of gets taken into different contexts. So I just want to level set initially on where we kind of see digital trust, and it's really in three main categories. Okay, so the digital trust is, there's the easiest way to look at it of the trust of the user, right? Citizen trusting the service. So that's one aspect of your digital trust in government services. So having your citizens trust you and trust the activity that's going on. The second piece of trust, I think, is about the technology itself. Right? Again, next door we were talking about building technology that's strong enough and robust enough that can withstand fraudsters, being tested by our citizens and tested by fraudsters and tested by ourselves to make sure that we have trust in the technology. So there's trust from our people, trust from the user, trust in the technology. And then the other piece that I want to make sure we touch on, and it's something that we at Interact focus a lot of our time on, is trust between entities. Right? How can we build an ecosystem of trust? So the ecosystem of trust means that you have, take a federal government use case, different departments, multi-jurisdictional, right? Different levels of government in Canada, and public sector and private sector, right? How are we establishing trust across entities to be able to build an ecosystem of digital trust? So that's kind of what I'm going to walk through today. Is I'm going to try and spin where we were going to take this and base it on a little bit on the last session, so that we can always remind ourselves of those three types of digital trust. So how does the citizen trust the service? Is the technology good enough to be trusted? And how do we have trust between entities within our ecosystem? Okay? So like I said, I don't need to get too much into what is Interact. You've all known Interact for 40 years now. #1 trusted financial services brand in Canada. And really what we've done in the past is focused on being a network provider, managing that ecosystem part, right? So you look at the debit network, you look at the e-transfer network, those are our two main product streams. Interact's interaction with the citizen is fairly light, right? You're coming through, let's say, your bank, as opposed to coming through Interact, but you have a little Powered by Interact logo. There's consistency there. We're not directly charging the citizen anything for our service. We're doing the monitoring, we're managing and reducing fraud across the network, and we're delivering and supporting that 24/7, which is kind of over time just naturally built trust with citizens. And establishing that trust in the financial services sector has allowed us to grow and expand into other network opportunities. And that's where I mentioned my role specifically. I spend most of my time focused on digital identity. So digital identity isn't actually that much different than the financial services sector in a sense, because rather than having a network of operators who can provide banking information and transfer funds, we have a network of identity providers, right, who can issue credentials for relying party consumption. And in both cases, the user's in the middle, right? The user controls their assets, and the user controls who has access to them and how it's managed. So I'm here to talk about the opportunity that we have to establish digital trust in those three different ways that I mentioned, and some guiding principles that we live by to make sure it's done conveniently and securely. So if we can establish digital trust across public and private sector, then we can kind of build that relationship with our citizens, and hopefully we can unlock economic growth and put our citizens in control of their data. Okay, and I know it's kind of me on stage and you there, but feel free to jump in anytime if there's hands or comments or questions, or we can save them to the end. So why digital enablement matters? I always like to start with something tangible. So what's the use case? What's the user journey? What pain points exist today? And how can we solve them by establishing digital trust? So I'm going to do that. I'm going to try and spin on what we talked about before, touching on those 3 categories of digital trust with some of these specific use cases. One use case that we like to talk about a lot is a new student coming to Canada. Okay? So let's say Jane, she's a new student. She gets accepted into Ottawa U, let's say Ottawa University for a nursing program. Okay, so the university is going to issue her a letter of acceptance. And to get her study permit, we have our first use case, which is at the bottom here, immigration. Okay, so she has to be able to come to Canada. So there's a study permit process. So she's going to send in her letter of acceptance, and she's going to send in a picture of her passport. And actually, if she, goes through that process successfully, she actually has to physically mail her passport to Canada as part of the enrollment process. So there's our first immigration use case, our first opportunity. If we have a trusted network, and this is where I talk about the ecosystem piece, right? So if we have a trusted network that can support a digital credential, then we can save a significant burden of that use case that I just walked through, and we're actually significantly increasing security and privacy, right? I wouldn't feel very safe putting my passport in the mail, and so I know many others wouldn't as well. And that's what I'm going to try and touch on, is going through Jane's user journey to say, okay, where are we establishing trust between different parties, as well as between our citizens, so that we can build on that? And these are all future-looking things, right? We're all working towards different ways of achieving these goals. I think some of them are attainable today. Some of them take time, like governance and process and policy. And so that's just step 1 of Jane's journey. So it started a little rocky. Okay, so next is air travel, which some people have done to get here today. Many of us have done before. So Jane has to travel to Canada, so she's going to use her passport. She'll travel to Canada, and when she lands, she's likely going to use that document over and over and over again as her identity. Now, as Michael mentioned next door, that's not actually an identity document, it's a travel document, but we use it as an identity document. And this again goes to kind of a network opportunity of, you can leverage a document that was made for something, right? A travel document was made for travel, but we have trusted processes that we can rely on to turn that into an identity. So how can we turn that into an identity that she can continue to reuse? And I look at myself when I travel domestically quite a bit. You flash your driver's license and they make sure the name is the same, but they don't know if it's revoked. They don't know if that's a fraudulent card. So again, an opportunity to kind of build up our ecosystem of information and pass that across jurisdictions. Okay, so now she's in Canada, she's landed. As part of that initial process, she actually had to prove that she had funds. That's part of your requirement to be a student. And so now she wants to open a bank account, right? So we've covered air travel, immigration, let's go to the top, banking and commerce. So to open a bank account, they want to see her study permit and they want to see her passport. So what does that mean? She's going to have to go in person, right? Because she is physically holding both of those things. So another opportunity where we can move that to a digital channel. There's significant savings that we see throughout this that obviously the citizens are going to enjoy the benefits of better services online, but also government, FI, private sector can really gain from reducing the impact on these manual processes. Okay, so she's had to do that in person. She had to mail her passport. She was showing her identity at the airport. Now she's here. I can go through all these use cases, right? Real estate. She's going to need a place to stay. We bought a new house recently, and there's a photocopy of my driver's license at the lawyer. There's a photocopy of my driver's license at the real estate agent. If anyone is in a hotel right now, they probably have a photocopy of your ID document sitting at the front desk. All things that we can make more secure for our citizens and easier for them to do. Okay. Another one that we talk about a lot is employment. The credential and identity space isn't just about your government-issued ID, right? It's not just about taking a passport, making it digital, and going to use it anywhere you want. Like, I want to take that and go buy cannabis online. It's about a broader network where if we can have a trusted ecosystem where entities can trust each other and it's cryptographically signed and it's secure, then you can look at employment use cases, right? Let's say she graduates, she now has a degree, a diploma, right? Can we have evidence of that digitally and be able to share it securely and efficiently? She wants to be a nurse, so maybe she has a registered nurse practitioner, right? How can she prove her identity over and over again? And then, of course, there's her personal use cases that I mentioned, right? Lottery and gaming, she has to prove her identity. You want to rent a car, you got to prove your identity. I'll stop with the use cases, but in the middle, simple and secure digital verification can really enable access to our services across our economy. And that's what we want to focus on is how do we establish digital trust? One, get the citizen to trust the services, and not just government services, but any operating service. And that's something that Interac's had to learn over 40 years, right? Fraud was high initially when they rolled out the debit network. How do you bring that down? How do you make sure that there's consistency across the network so that everyone's treated equal? And then number two, how do you have technology that can be trusted, right? You need to validate the technology. This is such important and secure information, our identity, that we want to make sure that we're not using new technology to deliver it, right? We need to use trusted, secure technology that we've relied on for years. And then third is what I've tried to hint on is that ecosystem piece. Create the digital trust between entities, right? How can this department in the government trust that department in the government? How can Ontario trust federal? How can municipal trust here? And how can private sector trust that? So that we can have an ecosystem where Joe's Corner Store has the same opportunity to have this, to be a player in the ecosystem just like the federal government does. Here's some statistics, just some big ones at the top from DIAC. I won't touch on that. I'll focus on the right here, which is what I tried to hint at before. Operational efficiency, right? If we can establish digital trust across these different channels, then we'll have significant efficiency for our citizens, and we're going to have significant cost improvement across our economy. One stat that we did in a study with the financial institutions, it's estimated that $100 million per year would be saved per FI if they could reduce some of those manual costs and fraud, and that main use case is creating a bank account online. Okay? Increased integrity. Right? How many times in that flow did I just say you had to mail your passport, there's copies of your identity documents? How can we make sure that fraud is reduced? We're actually adding security by having a digital ecosystem. The hard part is how do you convince the citizen that that's more secure, right? How do you educate folks? Go ahead. Yeah. No, jump in. I was hoping this would be a little more informal than me on stage, but go ahead.
I work for immigration. So
perfect.
My question is, when you're talking about different departments, right? But what about across, like we're talking international lines?
Absolutely.
So how does one government, because I think Mike Pilger, the last presentation did a good idea of talking about having trust also in the issuer of documents.
Yep.
And so it's having that trust mutually between governments of how they do issue those credentials in some cases, because we do have to test all of those things, and we're trying to come up with other ways to streamline it. But some of it comes down to trust between governments, and sometimes there's underlying geopolitical issues as well, or even, like we're talking here about mailing a passport, some people are in positions where they can't even get access to their documents. And so that level of trust is also difficult. So I'm wondering from a digital perspective, how, I guess my question is, in the last session we were talking about how difficult it even is to do in a national context. To what extent is it possible? I mean, financial institutions have been able to do it to a certain extent across international.
To a degree, yeah.
To a degree.
Yeah.
But still, they also have challenges. So I guess my question is, to what degree is it feasible to get there?
I don't think it's feasible at all, right? To be honest, like there's no silver bullet, as I mentioned earlier, right? I don't think that'll ever happen. But I do think there's opportunity within specific jurisdictions to have that, right? And I'm going to get to guiding principles a little bit later, and one of them we talk about is, openness and standards and following the same standards. And you look at passport, for example, well, everyone's following the same standard, right? So there is an opportunity to leverage that standard to be able to make sure that we can communicate and interoperate. And so there's opportunity, and like you said, the financial services sector is one example, but that only really works between certain jurisdictions, and I think it's going to continue to be that way. I think, like you said, folks will likely focus first internal, right? it's easiest, not that it's easy, but it's probably the easiest use case to drive. And then look at, friendly countries and work from there. But if we can all follow the same standards and approach, that's great. Not to say that can be done, but I think there is opportunity, right? And it really depends on the use case. When you talk about student visas, maybe not, right? That's a pretty niche use case. But when you talk about passport cross-jurisdictional, that should be pretty open to be able to follow the same standard. It's a little bit closer than some of those other use cases. Go ahead.
Might as well now that we have it open.
Yeah, let's do it.
So I think one of the key words that you had in your previous slide was simple. You had simple and secure access. And I think I'm just wondering, right, what criteria do you use to make things simple? Because that's, I think, something that is really complicated for governments.
Yep.
To try to make it as simple as possible and really boil it down to what's the value added from the transaction. And I think that's the beauty of Interact, right?
Yep.
You tap it, that's it, and it goes directly to your bank account.
Yep.
You made the transfer really easy with just a password. You don't even need to have like a capital or a number or
Yeah.
a special character in there. It's like just a button. So how do you make it as simple as possible?
I think, and I think the simple comment actually goes two ways, right? So there's how do you make it simple for the user, right? So that's the example you just gave, right? How simple is it to do an e-transfer or whatever else, right? And I think that actually can be accomplished quite easily if we can obtain scale and consistency. Right? So it's simple for me as a citizen and a user if I do the same thing at IRCC, at CRA, at Ontario, at Ottawa, at Costco. Right? If I can start doing the same thing and understanding that process, it naturally becomes simple to me. The part that's hard, I think harder to get simple, is to help the ecosystem, the programs, right? How do I make it simple for IRCC? How do I make it simple for Joe's Corner Store, right? And this is where, if I spin it around to the payments network, right? Everywhere you go, there's like 3 payment terminals, right? You're tapping your debit card, but everyone's following the exact same way, and those are rolled out at scale. So how do we have, tangible, well, not necessarily physically tangible because we're in the digital network, but how do you have, connectors and those type of technology enablers which make it easy for all of these different parties to talk? And that's really part of our goal as Interac. I don't want to make this about Interac, but that's kind of our goal, is how do we make it simple for Joe's Corner Store, for a department, to just use basic connectors that follow open standards that can get everybody on the same ecosystem. Because if you can make it simple for them, they're going to realize the cost savings over time, right, if you can digitize your transactions. I think the user half of it will be difficult initially. There will be resistance, and there's always considerations in this pocket or that pocket, but the more ubiquitous it can be, the better. It really just simplifies things for citizens. Go ahead.
So I understand everyone says start small and scale up. But if you say everyone starts their own small by themselves, they might never come together. I mean, it's a simple thing. Shouldn't we actually all be starting together, talking and then going off and building simple one-off and scaling it, and everyone trying to figure out which one works the best, instead of starting with, say, you go off and find your way, you do digital
Yep.
lending, and somebody else is another. Like, to me, it just seems like we're doing it the wrong way. We all go by ourselves. Like, did Interact really start with only thinking about one country, or did they already think about, like, we're going to need to do this? Where's the big vision, and then implementing it small instead of, like, the other way around?
Yeah, good point. And I'd love to say there's a clean answer to it, but there's not, right? But I think Canada has done a good job. I saw Tim Bauma here earlier. I don't know if he's in the room. But Canada's done a good job where we have a CIO strategy council. We have the DIAC, which is focused on creating those rules of the road, right? So that everyone's following the same rules of the road and the same standard so that they can scale appropriately. So that way, if there is niche players, they're all following the same rules and technology standards. So at least there's opportunity to scale that way. But I think to be able to, and we've tried, like, I've been attending DIAC meetings for the last 8 years. And so we try to bring all these pieces together and get everyone to talk, public sector, private sector, there's FIs involved, and it just becomes quite cumbersome and quite difficult. And so I think Canada has done a good job with DIAC and CIOSC to try and define the rails. How that'll actually roll out in reality, I'm not certain. I don't know. Go ahead.
Quick question. So going back to the simplicity aspect, so how do you make it simple but secure? Going back to one of the examples in the previous one about like if you're going to a bar so they can check your ID, they don't necessarily need to see your address. They don't need
Yep.
that other information. So how can we make it so that it's simple, so that it's all there, but only accessible for the people that need it?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, it's a good use case that you talk about, and it's one that I try and demo all the time, is, if you can create a digital credential and have it within an ecosystem, then you can actually control all of those things, right? So you have a verifier, someone like a bar that you need to go to, and they just say, I just need to know this person's 19 or older. Well, if you have technology that's smart enough, then that technology can say, here's a green check mark, right? Here's a green check mark and a picture. You get to see the picture for 5 seconds and your green check mark. And that's all you need to know, right? That's the benefit of the digital channel, right? So if you can do that digitally, you're actually enhancing privacy for your citizens. So we think that's a common use case that people talk about. It's one that people like to see because it's very tangible, but it really scales anywhere you go. You talk about a driver's license is for driving. If you're going to use it for identity, then why do you need to know my driver's license number, right? So the technology actually is able to abstract those things that you don't need. Yeah. I'm getting a thumbs up at the back. You want me to stop? Keep going?
You can finish up, thank you.
All right. I will flip quick. Some stats, okay? We surveyed 1,700 Canadians in the spring, and we just like to throw up some stats that we saw from those folks. I will be very fast. 74% want stronger identity verification doing it online. People get it. People want to do things online, but we still need to educate them. Look at the bottom. 72% want transparency on their personal information is used. 78% want to know it's stored in Canada. But if I just go to a website that says, give me your identity, how do I know those things? And that's where the restrictions come in. That's where people get concerned. So these are important statistics. So we need to focus on, remember I talked about 3 stages of digital trust? Education. How do we educate so that citizens trust it? Guiding principles, I mentioned this before. We've talked about simple a lot, right? User control and convenience, number 1. Make sure that people understand that it's easy to use. Ubiquity, I mentioned that earlier. How can you scale, have consistency across the market? Security via abstraction, that's kind of a straightforward technical thing. How do you have the technology trust? Your standards and your openness, we mentioned that earlier with IRCC. And for Interac, one thing that's benefited us in the financial services sector is the trusted brand. People, if you get an email from your bank that says, hey, here's $1,000, congratulations, you're probably going to be hesitant. And then you get an email from Interac that says, here's $1,000, and you say, thanks, and I'm going to log in with my bank account. So that's actually worked to gain trust and scale. Closing remarks on the right, benefits for Canadians. So we want efficient access to services, we want to enhance their privacy, put users in control of their data, reduce the cost as we talked about, and their last point of the day, simple. All right? So thank you very much. Sorry for rushing through that at the end, but I was glad we were actually able to have a conversation. If you need to catch me, I'll be walking around for the rest of the day. So thank you very much.